Growing up in Germany, I learned early on that most people here never seem to question one imperative. Rain or shine, come hell or high water, the German economy must stay on top of the international competition. And no matter what happens, the country must stay open for business. Nothing really matters except you all go to work and ensure economic growth. And as a student in school, I was kinda naive and swallowed that lesson. Only later in life, I remembered the wise words my father had told me every year when it started to snow. The media whipped themselves in a frenzy about the snow chaos on our roads, and everyone demanded the roads be free of snow and ice, and then he would say, "It's not a snow chaos, son, it's called the winter." What he wanted to tell me is that people always used to live according to the seasons and with the boundaries that nature had set, instead of fighting against them with all force all the time. Now, many years later, I think I do understand that it makes us all sick to constantly have to fight for the holy cow, ensuring that we stay competitive and on top of the game at all times. It's similar in the current crisis of this year 2021, where we see real hard lockdowns and curfews in many places in the world, while here in Germany, an astonishing number of businesses are kept open, and, at least in my anecdotal perception, the streets are as busy as ever. It's the same with the scrapyards, which so far have stayed open for business and to my knowledge have not been shut down for a single week except maybe for Christmas since all this started. But be that as it may, I'm sure that for many of you, especially those who are stuck at home, will appreciate a little trip to the scrapyards and doing some exploring in those mountains of trash. So here we are, and once again I'd like to ask you to come along, see what we find here today, and return to my workshop and give some of these treasures a second chance. Over here we have a really old concrete mixer and an even older wheelbarrow. Both items look somewhat interesting, so let me try to take a closer look at them. I dug that wheelbarrow out of there and I really like how it was made, incredibly rugged but also incredibly heavy and rusty. In fact, both the wheelbarrow and the mixer are unfortunately in extremely poor condition, and if I wanted to patch all the holes, I'd have more patches than original material. And what is that? A pretty good looking Stahlwille wrench. Not much to repair there, but this is a top-notch wrench and I'll keep that. Next to this old bathtub here, I found this strange looking vise. I'll take it home and we'll see what we can do with that. And I also found another vise here that still looks to be in okay condition. We're going to take care of that one as well. Here's a huge pile of aluminium parts, and this looks like an old sign saying Explosionsgefahr, danger of explosion. I'm collecting these signs and will eventually send some of them to other YouTubers in other countries. I think that will be fun. I also found these Aluminium Round Bar leftovers in that pile, and I always take those home for making custom parts on the lathe. This looks like unused welding wire. Well, but unfortunately the bobbin was severely damaged. Too bad. And here I found a strange looking device, maybe a grinder, in this container, and we're going to keep that. Also, yet another vise that I found in that same container. It's quite different from the others though. And guess what? Yet another vise has come my way. It belonged to my buddy's dad, who gave this to me a while ago, and we're going to take care of that in this video as well. So let's head back to the shop then and get going. We are going to begin by taking care of this rather whimsical looking device here. I'm pretty sure it is a grinder, but for what specific purpose it was made I cannot say. It also has this strange DIY charm to it, while some of its parts, on the other hand, were industrially manufactured. It's also quite old. It has an old-style 3-phase power plug called Kragenstecker, meaning collar plug in English, and at least in West Germany, these have been kinda outlawed back in 1975. I will start by taking this grinder apart, and the first thing I notice is this left-hand knurled nut, which tells us the rotational direction that the grinder should be operated with. The nut and these flanges here are super rusty. I can hardly get them off, and we will have to remove that rust properly. An old rusty bolt is also used to put tension on the induction motor and thus on the belt. I'm releasing some of that tension to get the belt off. And the most DIY looking feature of this contraption is that the parts in the front, which are proper aluminium castings, are connected to the motor in the back with an old rusty piece of L-bar. After removing that motor assembly from the front part, I want to disassemble those castings in order to replace the grease in the old bearings. Upon taking them off their base, we can also free the belt, which I will clean up in just a minute. The wheel guard on the one side and a round piece of aluminium on the opposite side cover a pair of ball bearings inside and retain the lubricant. On the insides of those bearings, we find their counterparts in these disc-shaped repositories holding more grease. The grease is really old and dirty, and so are the parts holding the bearings. Everything is cleaned with WD-40 and an old rag. I first tried to clean the nut and flanges just with some steel wool, but it wasn't enough. I put them into the ultrasonic cleaner to remove grease from the surface. After that, I'm preparing this little bath of citric acid. The parts will stay in there for a number of hours now. In the meantime, after the bearings have been cleaned, I apply new lubricant on both sides. Taking a closer look at the castings while cleaning everything, I still don't know what to make of this. There is no tool rest, but the little green steel pieces in the front clearly serve to hold something down. Any ideas? Let me know in the comments. I'm now also at least cleaning the belt. To test this device, we will keep this one. On the long run, it should probably be replaced though. After all this, I have now reassembled this mechanical part of the grinder. Let's have a look at the motor then. It has an old 3-phase power plug, and as I mentioned before, these have not been used for new machines since at least 1975, here in the West. However, in East Germany, they were still used until 1990, and frankly, in both East and West, there are still old houses and farms around that still have outlets for those plugs. We recently saw them when I explored this abandoned workshop in the woods in my last video. The old Bakelite switch must have broken off some time ago and was fixed with a screw. The old nameplate tells us that the motor was manufactured by Adam Baumüller in Nuremberg. This at least tells us that the grinder was probably not used in East Germany, as this is a West German company. It was probably just in a shop that still had the old style outlets. Upon removing this cast iron cover here, we can see the 6 connections to the stator windings of a 3-phase induction motor, as they have been standard in Germany for a long time. They allow you to run the motor in Y or delta configuration and on 400 or 230 volts respectively. Upon removing the switch enclosure, we can take a closer look at that switch. It should clearly be replaced, but unfortunately I have nothing at hand that I can replace it with. That's why we will keep it until we can see if we can get this thing at least running. I have removed the old wires and I'm brushing off the dirt between the contacts. In the next step, I'm installing new wires and a new 3-phase power plug to the old motor. Overnight, the flanges and some other parts have been inside the citric acid bath. And you can see that the acid has reacted with the rust by the yellowish color. By the way, citric acid is also used in food products and for removing lime scale in kitchens and bathrooms. So I guess it should be okay to dispose it this way. I rinse them off and put them on the hot stove to dry. And after that I use some more steel wool and WD-40 to again clean the surface, and they look pretty good again. I have reassembled everything now and the grinder should be ready for a test. Unfortunately, the grindstone that I ordered doesn't fit. It has a 32mm inner diameter, but the shaft is only 16mm. There is this plastic adapter piece, but it reduces the diameter down to 12mm. So remember the pieces of aluminium we found at the scrapyard? Well, let's make a custom adapter then. First, you always have to make sure the workpiece is running true. I then begin by machining the face of the cylinder, so that I have something halfway plain and smooth to work with. Now the tailstock chuck comes into play, and I use a center drill to pre-drill a hole. Now I start with a 6mm drill bit, and then I widen the hole carefully in steps of just a few millimeters until I end up with a 16mm drill hole. But the outer diameter is still way too wide, and we'll have to machine that down to 32mm. This is happening in many repetitive steps in which I reduce the diameter step by step until the grinding wheel fits onto the cylinder. In a final step, a 16mm thick disc has to be separated from the larger workpiece. And down here it is. Now that the wheel fits, we can put that nut on there and we're ready for a test. So as you can see, the old machine still does what, well, I think it's supposed to do, even though I have to say that I should build some kind of tool rest for this thing. Would you like to see an episode in which I just upgrade several of the devices I have repaired in this series over time? Thumbs up if you do. Before we go on with the repairs, there is one little thing I wanted to tell you. After having talked to a number of other video makers, I've decided to also publish my videos on an alternative video platform called Odyssey.com. It's just an additional service for those of you who are looking for alternative platforms. I posted a link to my channel down in the comments. Let's start to take care of all of those vices then. The first specimen we are going to take a look at is this rather strange contraption. It appears to be the case that a former owner has customized a general purpose vise for a specific job. I've already asked a bunch of people about their opinion, and most people have had the same idea as me. This was either modified to hold pipes or other cylindrical workpieces, or it is a makeshift press for compressing springs. What do you think? Leave a comment below. But be that as it may, the old attachments are kind of bent out of shape, and I actually also have no use for them, and that is why I'm going to remove them and restore this vise to its original functionality. And even though whoever did this certainly did a good job here, it is kind of obvious that this was a modification of the original design. Someone simply welded a steel angle piece directly to the jaws of this vise. And that's why I have now started to cut off pieces of those attachments with the big Hilti grinder I repaired in episode 16. This is episode 20 of this series. All other episodes can be found in the video description under this video. My idea here is to cut directly through, or at least very closely alongside, those weld seams. I first removed this corner on the sliding jaw. Now I'm cutting the opposite side. With those corners removed, I'm now able to make another fine cut right through the welds alongside the side of the faces. That way I was able to weaken those welds to a point where I'm able to punch the attachment of the jaw with a hammer, breaking loose the remaining welds sitting on the bottom side. The remaining material from that welding job will be cut and ground off in just a minute. In the meantime, I'm wire wheeling the surface in order to get rid of the rust and the remains of the old paint job. When doing this sort of work, I'm wearing a dust mask. Old paint often contains lead and other harmful substances. I'm also always wearing a face shield or protective glasses. While working on this video, for the first time ever, I'm trying protective glasses with anti-fog coating. Because when working outside at this time of year, especially when wearing a mask, those shields and glasses tend to get foggy in seconds, and then you can't see what you're doing. And whether those so-called anti-fog glasses are any good, well, more about that in a few minutes. I'm also detaching the screw from the slide to clean decade-old grease and dirt from the threads. The slide has a spring and a washer, retained by a little steel pin. I'm using a punch to drive the pin out on one side, then pull it out with pliers on the other side. Removing old grease, grime and dirt from threads is always a pain, and I hate it as much as anyone. One method that I have come to use a lot is to drench it in WD-40 or another solvent. Then take an old rag and turn the screw inside the rag, holding it tight as if it were a nut sitting on that screw. The rest of the dirt is then washed out with some more WD-40 and creative use of steel wool. I often pull the wool apart so that it forms a rope, and then I'm using that rope to go through the threads. And after removing the paint, we can see clearly that this type of vise was made from various sections that have been welded together during the manufacturing process. Today we can make some comparisons between models, and you'll see that this isn't the case with all vises. This vise has no exchangeable faces, but the fixed faces on these jaws still look almost untouched, except for the welds, and that is why I'm removing those welds with some rather surgical cuts. Other remains are ground off. In this spot here I had cut a little too deep when taking off those attachments, and that's why I will try to build that back up by means of TIG welding and grinding the weld back down to surface level. Not the most beautiful TIG weld I have ever shown to the world, but yeah, it doesn't really matter in this case as long as there is enough buildup in the first place. As you might know from some of my earlier videos, I really like the look of raw steel and cast iron, and when I work on really old tools, I often simply oil them and don't paint them at all. But in this case, we're talking about a fairly modern vise of a type that you could still buy today. So I thought that a new paint job would be fitting here. I'm using some tape to cover the faces, anvil, guides, and other parts where paint just doesn't make any sense. The shade that I'm using here is called Stealth Gray. While the paint is drying, we can have a look at the remaining parts. See, while the slide is moving through the opening in the fixed part of the vise, it doesn't really sit all that tight and will veer left and right. It will also cause unwanted vibrations and might even get stuck, unless it's pushed by this little guide here. All those smaller parts are first put into the ultrasonic cleaner, and then I remove some remaining dirt with steel wool. The little piece of sheet metal should act as a guard against dirt and metal filings from entering into the slide mechanism. The tape is removed. The parts are greased and the tension on those screws is adjusted until the sliding jaw moves smoothly again. Looks like this one is ready for action once more. But there is no time to lose, since we have 3 more to take care of. Now that we have removed those attachments, it is fairly obvious that the second vise is very similar to the first one we repaired. This vise is sliding open in the front, and it was welded together from sections. It also has similar guards on the slide, and yes, this time 2 of those, for the front and the back side, are still there, and they are being held together by a spring, which is pretty smart. But this time, the nut holding the main screw is its own part and can move to a degree and can be taken out. This vise also has screws that can be used to adjust the tension on the slide, to keep it in line, so to speak, but the idea was implemented very differently. And since there's really no damage here apart from the rust, I can again proceed with wire wheeling all accessible surfaces. And again, faces, anvil and some other parts are taped, and the entire vise gets a new paint job. And with new grease, this vise is now ready for action again as well. Not the most spectacular of repairs, but that is not what this show should be about. Its core message should be that everything that can be saved should be saved. I'm happy about every little thing, no matter how mundane, that gets a new lease on life. So we just witnessed the repair of 2 vices, and because our 2 remaining objects are also vices, I'm going to make this rather short and just focus on the really important things that happened in these repairs. Now see, the next vise that we have here is a little different than what we had before. It doesn't open in the front, but in the back. It was not made from welded sections, but from complete cast iron pieces. And most importantly, as you can see on this photo from the internet here, it was not made in the West, but in socialist East Germany before the fall of the Iron Curtain. And that is something very rare around here because, well, I live in the West and we just did not have, even back then, many things from the Eastern Bloc states and also not from East Germany. So my greetings go out to the viewers in East Germany. One thing though that is still missing here, even though we have painted this and everything, is a handle. But in order to make the handle, it would be very, well, fitting to already have the lag vise repaired. So let's take a look at that. Now this one I haven't from the scrap, but I have covered 2 entire repairs of these types of vices called lag vices before on this series. So let me make this rather quick. This one is special in that it was modified and also kind of repaired. It's very rusty because it was outside for decades apparently. And well, here are some steel plates in the back that were welded to this vise. Normally you have a clamp that is bolted onto the vise, so this was a modification. One thing that is, well, kind of annoying though is that the actual lag of this lag vise is missing and was replaced by this weird screw here, and I think that's not original. So what I decided to do here is to, of course, again, wire wheel the thing, grease everything up, you know the routine, but then also cut off this old lag here. And then I took this forged steel bar here. It's from a historic building. So I thought that it might be about the same material that this vise was originally made from. It might have been 100 years ago. So what I did is to TIG weld these parts together. So after finally reassembling this lag or blacksmith's vise, I covered everything in oil. I never paint these types of vices. And now we can use this to make a handle for our East German vise. I just take this piece of round bar stock here, I clamp that into the vise, and now I'm using the oxy torch to heat it up, and I do a little bit of forging with this blacksmith's vise, and especially with the little anvil in the back. And I use that anvil to round up the ends of the new handle for the GDR vise. And here is a little overview over all the vices we have repaired today. So we repaired 5 items here today. That means there are only millions left to go. Well, I hope that you liked this video, and if that is the case, then please give it a like to give me a clear sign to go on producing these types of videos. If you want to support this channel more actively, then you can become a supporter on patreon.com/tpai, or you can make a donation. And some ways you can do that are, for example, making a PayPal donation or a Bitcoin donation. And I put some links for those down in the video description. See you soon. And yeah, by the way, the problem with the anti-fog glasses is that the water still collects on the glasses. It's just in bigger droplets, at least when you're wearing a mask. So sorry, but it doesn't solve the problem.